we have thousands of athletes using Fuelin, lots of female athletes. And what we're seeing with the female athletes that are on the Fuelin site when they initially join is that perhaps they're under consuming protein and failing to match their carbohydrate intake to their needs in their chosen sport.
Hello and welcome back to Fuelin Sessions. My name is Scott Tindal. I'm the host for this show today, and joining me is one of my co-workers and registered dietitians, Megan Foley. Megan, welcome to the show and welcome to this series of discussions we're going to have, which is related to the Fuelin approach for fueling males and females and discussing the research around that and hopefully clearing up a lot of myths and misconceptions and misunderstandings related to the topic. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here. Excited to talk about some specifics for female athlete nutrition. And, you know, like you mentioned, there's so much information out right now on social media, on the internet about women, what women need to do for nutrition, specifically for exercise. So excited to talk about what we actually know about that topic.
Yeah, and well, that's a good segue in because I think the reality is there's probably lots to learn and not that much information out there. So we can only do our best based on what available information there is. And look, I want to kick this off by talking about a few comments made by a fairly well-known nutritionist. I think his name is Asker Udenkrop, and he's, you know, probably regarded as one of the world's best or world's most knowledgeable sort of nutritionist, physiologist, whatnot. And he was talking about this similar situation, and I thought he summed it up really well with 4 very succinct points. And that was that point number 1, he said there are fewer studies of women versus men. Yep, we all agree on that. Number 2, women are different to men. We agree on that. That the current recommendations for fueling are based on men, and as he said, therefore they must be wrong. Well, that's the perception. Okay. Yet, as he said, point 4, that is an unknown, and we cannot say point 3 definitely. And I think the way that he has summed that up is beautiful, because unfortunately, what we're seeing is this sort of, you know, fight against research on men around nutrition and saying we can't apply it to women, but we don't actually know if that is fact or fiction. And so what we want to do today is dive into the points and what we've outlined. I think we've outlined 10 sort of high level points that is really going to sort of be, I guess, the genesis of what we will talk about throughout this series of men and women fueling and how Fuelin does it and what the research says. Sound good?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, so I think at the start, what we're going to do is establish these points. So we're going to go through each point and we'll just go through them and we can have a little discussion through it. But as I just want to emphasize for listeners, these are sort of the high level points. We're not getting into the nitty gritty on this show, but we just want to establish where we sit from a principle standpoint. Okay. So point number 1, as stated above, as Asker said, there is a growing body of evidence for women, yet it is still lacking with regards to women. And there is a difference between eumenorrheic and amenorrheic, i.e. women with a normal cycle or absent cycle, and the lack of research specific to these conditions is also missing. Okay, so point number 1 is there's just a lack of evidence at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's pretty easy to see that women have historically been excluded from research because they didn't want to have to account for the menstrual cycle, right? It's another thing to consider when you're doing your analysis. And not every woman's cycle is the same. I mean, that's each woman's individual cycle, but then also comparing one woman to the next, there's going to be variation. So it just makes things a whole lot harder to account for.
Yep, and I think I have heard historically as well, and I don't know if this is correct, that a lot of research was male dominated because recruiting women was actually very difficult as well, just given the way in which society and women maybe weren't available to actually be recruited for the time. So I think there's a lot of, you know, probably historical issues with a lot of the research, and that women, yes, whether they're excluded on purpose or just because of circumstance, I think that is something to consider. But certainly what we will see is, I think, more, and we are seeing more and more research occurring with women involved. So the amount of research is growing.
Yes,
So
yes,
let's move on.
absolutely. Yeah, and so we know that while we use research as the basis for nutritional guidelines, we can also talk about what we're seeing day to day with our Fuelin athletes. And we have thousands of athletes using Fuelin, lots of female athletes. And what we're seeing, general trends with the female athletes that are on the Fuelin site when they initially join is that perhaps they're under consuming protein and failing to match their carbohydrate intake to their needs in their chosen sport. And those two factors are going to be key to success for nutrition and performance.
Yeah, 100%. And as you said, look, it's anecdotal what we see, but we are seeing it across thousands of athletes. And when you start to see trends occurring so frequently, you start to sort of see those patterns. So, point number 3, look, we acknowledge that the hormones of women do play a role, physiologically speaking. Changes in estradiol across the menstrual cycle are associated with changes in energy substrate utilization or oxidation, okay, in physically active women. And what I mean by that is that you will get better carb utilization in the follicular phase, potentially better fat utilization in the luteal phase. However, does this mean separate nutrition recommendations are required? We just do not know that based on the current evidence.
Yep. Yeah. And I think this is where a lot of speculation is coming in, right? Like, this is where people want to make new and exciting recommendations based off of this new, hot topic of changing your nutrition around your menstrual cycle, but we honestly just don't know.
Yeah. And it relates, I mean, very much to the next point that you're going to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is that there may be some evidence of changes in performance based off of the phase of a woman's menstrual cycle, but this is by no means definitive. There's been a lot of conflicting research here, some showing trivial changes across the menstrual cycle, some showing best performances in the luteal phase, others showing best performances in the follicular phase. And so, what this really means is that we can't make blanket statements or recommendations around this. And it would be wrong to say that all women are impacted similarly by their menstrual cycles.
Yeah. And look, again, based on what I've experienced working with professional, elite age group female athletes, the concept of cycling, and I put in inverted commas cycling, the nutrition based on the menstrual cycle, more often than not, it's a pain in the ass for the practitioner. It's a pain in the ass for the athlete. And majority of the time, it doesn't have the impact that I think is desired or,
Yeah.
thought that might happen. And so in the end, we revert back to best clinical practice around nutrition based on the training, i.e., the intensity and the duration, which, yes, again, is driven by a lot of male research, yet, when done correctly, even in women, appears to still have very good effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was an article I sent you a few days ago. I think it was released in March, and it was talking about how the changes in the hormonal profile with progesterone and estrogen, those factors didn't impact endurance performance in women, but perceived negative effects of menstrual cycle did have an impact on performance in women.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see interesting where this will go in the future.
Yeah, I think even Daniela was talking about that when I spoke to her on the sessions I did with with her regarding that. It was like, psychologically speaking, she wanted to know that she could cope whenever her period came on, to be able to deal with that, because it's going to happen potentially in a race. And it actually did happen at Kona. But she knew, because she had trained through that, she had trained with intensity, with carbohydrates, whatnot, that she felt ready to go.
Yeah.
And so I think that perception of negative performance, I think, as we know, whether it's placebo or just the psychological effect, it's like, it's going to be very powerful. And so I think
Yes.
that brings us to point number 5, which is, based on the current evidence for performance gains for women engaging in endurance and strength exercise, the research does not support claims around specific fueling nutrition for the menstrual cycle. Okay. Now that's going to be met with probably a lot of opposition, a lot of oohs and ahs, but it's just what is there at the moment. There is a lack of evidence to make concrete recommendations on manipulating nutrition for the menstrual cycle at this point in time. I'm not saying it's not going to in the future. I'm just saying at this point in time, based on the research and also based on anecdotal experience, the recommendation is not there.
Yes, absolutely. And that's not to say that women can't have the free choice to make changes to their training. It's simply saying that if you do make changes to your training, the nutrition recommendations need to be around your new training schedule.
Correct. And I think this is the really important point. I know I bang on about this point a lot, but if you want to go down this route of cycling, manipulating nutrition based on carbohydrates, maybe in the follicular phase, because you can cope with it better and you can put out more power. And then in the luteal phase, okay, you oxidize and utilize fat better, then your coach and your training has to also replicate that. You can't be going and fueling yourself on high fat amounts, but trying to do high intensity threshold sessions in the luteal phase and fuel it with a lot of fat. It
Yes.
will just end up in a disaster.
Sounds like
So
a poor time. Just doesn't sound fun, to be honest.
does not sound fun. So if you are considering this, and we're not saying you can't, but be aware that the training is going to dictate the nutrition, generally speaking. But if you then go and say, right, the nutrition is going to dictate the training, then the training has to match what the fuel is you're providing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Moving on to our next point. So when it comes to
Point number 6.
point number 6, yes, thank you. When it comes to low energy availability, there may be differences between males and females. And when we're talking about energy availability, we're talking about the amount of dietary energy remaining for the body to perform essential functions after accounting for the energy expenditure from exercise. So that's just the definition of what that is. It's important to note around energy availability that it's incredibly difficult to estimate this in the real world. But we want to acknowledge and highlight that there may be differences between men and women in this area, especially to cope with a reduced calorie intake over chronic periods of time. Men may be better at being able to cope with lower calorie amounts compared to women.
Yeah, and look, there are these numbers that are thrown out. Women, if you go below 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, and men potentially maybe half of that, around 15 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, that's when things potentially could start to become problematic. And again, it's not talking short term. We're not talking a day or 2 days. With women, maybe 6 or 7 days at that very low level could cause some issues. For men, it's really unknown. But we do know there are certainly differences in the way that men and women respond to low energy availability.
Yep, absolutely. And moving on to point number 7, we need to have increased awareness around some micronutrient deficiencies in females. So we just tend to see higher incidence of iron deficiency, either with or without anemia, whether this is due to menstrual losses or lower overall energy intake, or potentially even just the food choices that females are making. It's something that we need to be aware of when we are working with female athletes. Additionally, we tend to see more issues with bone mineral density in women versus men. So we need to pay particular attention to calcium intake, um, and also vitamin D intake as well. So just making sure that these levels are adequate.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of points there. So something we obviously do with Fuelin is at the start we do recommend a baseline level for a number of blood tests. And look, we're not recommending blood tests for a blood type diet or anything like that. We know that's BS. What we are looking for is certain markers in the blood that could be screened and actually make a significant difference, not only to your health, but also your performance. And if we're talking about iron deficiency with or without anemia, I mean, it's just a huge game changer when women, if they are deficient or insufficient, when they start either eating more heme iron containing foods, i.e., probably red meat, or supplementing with a heme iron supplement, it can make a huge difference to how that female athlete is feeling. And it can make a huge difference to a male athlete as well. But as you
Yeah.
highlighted, it's just more frequently common in women. So it is something, again, for women to pay attention to. Your point about bone mineral density, again, we do recommend it, Fuelin. Look, go and get a DEXA scan. And I know, look, people will say, oh, DEXAs, they can have pros and cons. But unfortunately, what we are seeing at Fuelin is a very high number of younger female and male athletes who have low bone mineral density. And that, it just should not be happening, but you're not going to be aware. It's not like you're probably going to feel you've got low bone mineral density. Like you're not going to feel that until you probably develop a stress fracture or a stress reaction. And so get on top of it. Look, you get screened, you've got great bone mineral density, great. You probably don't need to get that element of a DEXA done again for a number of years. But if you do have low bone mineral density, well, let's do something about it. So obviously address things like your vitamin D, your calcium intake through food, through potential supplementation, and probably resistance training, and
Yes.
start to implement those elements into your program to ensure that you're actually healthy. And I think the last point there that you talked about was, and Holly highlighted this, and we obviously highlighted this on Holly's episode where, she was pregnant. She then was lactating, breastfeeding, and calcium demands go up for a female during that period of time. And you need to be aware of that. And you will most likely require supplemental calcium to fortify your diet in order to meet your calcium needs during that breastfeeding period. And that, again, that is unique to women.
Yeah.
And it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, and I know you experience this too, but just working with athletes, and athletes always want to know what supplement they can take, right? Like what can they take to benefit performance? And it always comes down to you're going to get the biggest benefit from correcting micronutrient deficiencies versus adding on some other supplement on top of that, right? Like make sure your health is the foundation, and that's going to be the best thing that you can do for your performance long term.
Yeah, and that micronutrient, the majority of that is going to come through your diet and
Sure.
fruits, vegetables, good quality whole foods. That's where you're going to get majority of that from. Your seeds, your nuts, your grains, and then obviously, depending on your dietary preference, things like red meat is going to supply a lot of that iron for you. And
Yeah,
if you
absolutely.
choose to go vegetarian or vegan, then you need to then be very conscious of what you're eating on a day-to-day basis to meet that micronutrition requirements.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, point number 8, in-session fueling. Periods of caloric restriction impacting performance can be offset through correct in-session fueling when the intensity and the duration are accounted for. And this is a big part of what we do at Fuelin. And we know that, look, we're not saying that you want to be in a calorie restricted period all the time. However, we also need to acknowledge that there are going to be periods of time where athletes are going to want to improve body composition. They're going to want to drop some weight. So there are going to be periods of reduced calories in order to be losing body fat or body weight. We do acknowledge that you have to be in a calorie deficit. And so by controlling what you're doing out of training, yet and being in that calorie deficit, yet fueling those sessions appropriately, you can offset some of those performance detriments. And I think that is a really important point for women who will maybe think, oh, well, I'm just going to do this 2 hour zone 2 session. I'm going to burn a lot of calories and I'm not going to eat anything, or I'm going to do this hour and a half, high intensity run and not take in anything because it's going to result in more calorie burnt. It will just end up undoing all the good work you do because you feel so bad at the end of it that you got no energy. And in the end, you crack and you end up binge eating. And that just undoes everything you're doing. So, and that happens to men as well. I'm not going to
Yeah.
say that, but this in-session fueling can be very effective for men and women, especially when you're in a caloric deficit outside of that.
Yep. Yep. It all comes down to having energy availability in and around training, right? Like that's when we need it the most. You need the carbohydrates when you are actively burning them. And there just seems to be this trend of athletes trying to lose weight, and oftentimes female athletes trying to lose weight who are just foregoing that in-session fueling because they're hoping to, lower their calorie intake that way, where they'd actually probably see a greater benefit from taking on carbs during those sessions.
Completely.
Yeah. All right. So point number 9, we want to talk about the impact of hormonal contraceptives. So simply, more studies just need to be done with the inclusion of participants taking hormonal contraceptives compared to those who aren't. And this gets really tricky because there's so many different variations of hormonal contraceptives, right? There's the pill, which can either be progesterone only or a mix of estrogen and progesterone. There's the IUD, there's the implant, right? There's all these different options that women have, which is great, but it makes research a bit more challenging. And from what we know right now, there's preliminary evidence that shows both positive and negative effects of hormonal contraception for women engaged in various sports. I know you sent me one article that was showing upper body muscle gains for women that were on oral contraceptives, and I thought that was kind of amazing. Very interesting to think about. But
yeah, I think that one's been making the rounds on social media, get on the
yeah,
pill and get the gains. So
yeah, that's a new
yeah,
marketing technique I hadn't heard before. But
exactly.
one point that I want to bring up here around hormonal contraceptive and something that I feel very passionately about is just the lack of general knowledge about the etiology and treatment of REDS. So, it's been very common for practitioners to treat amenorrhea with oral contraceptives, and we know that that's not actually treating the cause of REDS or low energy availability. And so hopefully, that's something that just increased awareness women will benefit from in the future.
Yeah. And look, I think the hormonal contraception piece, and we will cover that in a later episode, but it's certainly something that is, yeah, a lacking research, I think is probably the best. So, it may be a short episode or it may be a long episode covering what we don't know. But yeah, it's a very fascinating area. And obviously as a male, you're going to have much better insights into that from a personal perspective, but also, it's not something, and being 100% open, that I've paid a lot of attention to. And it is something that you've been very good at making me aware of. And I think other athletes, like Holly, for instance, has certainly opened my eyes to that impact, and when she had it removed and the impact of that on her body. And it was just something that I don't think we're taught about a lot as well. When we go through, our training, we don't necessarily, I can't even remember if there was a module on, there probably wasn't even a module on female physiology and the
Right.
differences, but there certainly wasn't one on hormonal contraception. So,
Yeah.
probably something that these courses and universities and whatnot should be looking for in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to see what the research tells us here, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a really interesting area and something that's important to a lot of women, and so I'm excited to see over the next couple of years what we learn here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's a really important point. Over the years, okay?
Yeah.
Like, it's just this thing about nutrition. It's black or white. And it's like, no, there is so much gray there. And that gray is probably you as an individual. but that gray is also, there's just a lot of lack of research. And
Yes.
a lot of what we do in the field is way ahead of, what's in the research and what's in academic papers. And I'll give you a good example of that before we get to the summary of point number 10 was, it was working with Sarah Piano way back when, we were starting Fuelin. And, again, if anyone wants to listen to that episode, it's a great episode with Sarah talking about how we approached it. And back in 2017, which, it's not that long ago, but still long enough that there was nothing on like high carb fueling. There was definitely nothing around high carb fueling with females. And Matt Dixon thought I was a crazy Aussie telling Sarah that she needed like 100, 120 grams an hour of carbs. And, that was ahead of the time. And like there were I'm not saying I was the only one doing it. There were lots of practitioners doing it, but there wasn't the research that you see today. And there wasn't that commonality of like, okay, everyone needs, if you're pushing high numbers, you need a lot of carbs. So again, like what we do in the field and what we do as practitioners is sometimes, and I think that is an important point for women and men, is, it can be ahead of the research.
Yep. Yeah. And you have to look at the individual athlete, right? Like you have to look at what they're dealing with and help them through those situations as best as we can.
Yeah, correct. So if we're going to summarize this, and this is point number 10, the big takeaway. So back to the opening statement from Asker, surrounding the current recommendations for women. And there is a lack of evidence, but that does not always mean a lack of effect. We know more research is required to make definitive recommendations for women. We acknowledge that. This lack of evidence does not mean that we've thrown out all of the solid nutritional recommendations built around male research simply because it is based on men. And that is a really important point. We know that when sound nutrition practices are applied to women, a lot of the time we see very positive effects. And so in my and Fuelin team's experience, the overall impact is very positive for women when Fuelin addresses the key components of nutrition, i.e. the macronutrients, the total energy requirement, nutritional quality, and meal timing based on training volume, training intensity, and an athlete's personal biometrics, such as weight, physical activity, and their goal, whether that's weight maintenance, weight loss, or weight gain.
Yes, absolutely. A solid nutrition foundation is going to get you really far in this process.
Okay, so what we've done there is outline sort of Fuelin's top 10 principles related to women and men, the available research, key components such as carbohydrates, fuel utilization, cycle, contraception, performance gains, health gains, elements related to that. So what we're now going to do in future episodes is break down each of those components. And I think the next one we're going to tackle, everyone's favorite, well, probably most people's favorite, is carbohydrates. So when we come back, we will deep dive into carbohydrates, the research around those related to women and men, performance, and health gains. Okay?
Looking forward to carbs.
Everyone looks forward to carbs. So cool. Well, thanks so much, Megan. I think it's a great start, and I think this will really pique the interest of a lot of athletes, not just women. Hopefully men also dive into this because there are plenty of male athletes out there with partners who are training and racing. And I think it's really important for you as men to understand what women go through and what the research currently reveals, so you can have open conversations around that and make sure that you're all informed. We don't want anyone having arguments over dinner over carbohydrates of who should have what and whatnot. So hopefully it does enlighten everyone on this topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very excited to continue on in this topic and really just get into these details.
Cool. Okay. I'll catch you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.